I'm Wes the Explosion, and I'm back for another video, comparing and contrasting the designs for Mega Man Classic and Battle Network. For a quick recap, in the Classic series, most characters are machines called Robot Masters, and in Battle Network, most of these guys are reimagined as internet programs called Netnavis. I previously paired the characters from Mega Man 1, listed by index number, up against their newer equivalents, and surprisingly, it was a tie until I introduced special guest Dr. Light/Ikari, putting Classic up 1 point. 5-4. This time we're looking at Mega Man 2, which will have another bonus character as well as a problem we didn't have to deal with previously. Veterans of both series probably already know what I'm talking about, and I have something special set up for it, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Capcom's making it harder on us this time. But for now, you get out your pen and pencil so you can tally up your own scores, and let's get on with round 2. We're starting off with Metal Man, though it's because of his number 009 this time, not because his weapon's busted. Looking at the original, he's primarily red and yellow, though I thought he was more red and blue. For some reason. Either way, upper body and head, largely red. Antennae and boots, largely yellow, with just a bit of blue on his chest and silver for the buzzsaws, as you'd expect. Speaking of, the extra metal blades on his shoulders look cool, and I do kinda like the pattern that some of the bosses follow by having their weapon on their foreheads. With the blades being his weakness though, I do worry he might take himself out if he moves his arms the wrong way. And while I'm not sure why he has those antlers on the side of his head, given how many other RMs just have the basic circle with the smaller indented circle in the middle for ears, I really appreciate the extra pizzazz this gives him. He also wears a metal face mask, which makes me ask, with the less detailed in-game sprites, did anyone else think Metal Man looked like some sort of deranged doctor? Either way, he seems pretty gnarly and not like the sort of guy you'd want to mess with, so we're starting off strong. Moving on to the Navi, this guy is really big, and also very red and blue. So that's where my brain was getting mixed up. Anyway, the buzzsaws are still there, though the ones on his shoulders are more like hoops, and his design now integrates gears around his wrist and legs, which makes him look pretty sturdy. Speaking of, his fists are massive and very blocky, so you know that when he decks you, it's gonna feel more like getting hit with a piece of industrial equipment than just a simple flesh and blood punch. And just because he didn't have enough tools at his disposal, on his back, he has some sort of propulsion keeping him floating off the ground, as well as rocket launchers just behind his head. The guy's just built for demolition, and while the Robot Master looks like he'd be fast with precise, lethal attacks, EXE seems like he could take some hits while just brute forcing any opponents to death. If I had to choose between the two, and I do, I'd give it to the Netnavi. I love brawler characters, and his fist just looks so threatening, to say nothing of all his other weapons he has on his person. I also did like his color scheme a bit more, and given how 11 and Smash have made me really associate Gears with the Mega Man franchise, I also like their inclusion here. Battle Network takes first point. Next up is Airman and Airman.EXE, both very defeatable enemies. Airman actually kinda kicked off a trend, having his head integrated into his upper body, leading to a design motif called Airman type, so he's got that going for him. The no neck thing is interesting, getting rid of an obvious human weakness while making it harder to look behind him. Bit of a trade-off, but NES sprites tend to always face the screen anyway, so probably an easy choice to make. But back to Airman specifically. He's got his peepers up top, and a big dumb fan in his center, which also looks like a mouth. His main colors are blue, like the sky, and yellow for the fan, forehead jewels, and his glove and boots, which work for contrast. Bodysuit's black, so it doesn't get in the way too much. I also like how, in official art, as well as the silly little figure I have of him, he looks pretty ridiculous, but his sprites always look so darn ticked off. Looking at EXE, he has largely the same build. He's still blue, he has no neck, he still has a fan in the middle of his chest, though it takes up less space this time. He's making a bit more use of the blue this time though, most of his yellow has been replaced with silver, with some green thrown in alongside a more orangish shade of yellow, so a bit more colorful as well. He also has more edge to him, between the ridges on his torso and arms. I'd say EXE is the cooler looking version, but at the same time, he's a headless man with a big dumb fan in the middle of his quote unquote face. Trying to add some edge to his design might be missing the point. And while I don't think a wide range of colors is a bad thing, at the same time, some of the extras feel tossed in just to differentiate him from his older brother, rather than fitting the design, whereas original Airman seems to have just as many shades as he needs. While I like them both, I like Classic more. But of many jokes, the Bubble Men are here. Rather than making him the obvious blue, the RM's actually green, which somehow feels more natural. Be it underwater plants or just reflections from nearby trees, this is actually more what I'd expect to see if I were to look down into a lake. And hey, we do get some blues around his arms, legs, and tools, as well as yellow around the joints and a red jewel on his chest, so his secondary colors contain all the primaries. I kinda like his color selection. From his accessories, you can tell he's a water-based boss, from his flippers, to his mask and goggles, to the air tanks on his back, though your first instinct might be to call him Scuba Man. While he has a buster, I believe he also uses the contraption on his head to fire out his attacks. I normally don't give the guy much thought, so this is probably the closest I've ever looked at him, but I do think he has a pretty good design that doesn't always come across in-game. Moving on to the Navi, EXE is pretty silly. He has a very round head, and the ear bits look like shower heads, which is cute. He's primarily different shades of blue, which might seem a little basic, but it works, with a few yellows thrown in and a green visor over his face. While he doesn't have flippers per se, he does have a wide rim around each of his feet that would function just as well. Plus he has the tanks on his back, as well as the little cannon thing on his head to fire out bubbles, so the resemblance is there even if it's not as obvious as some of the others. Besides that, his face looks kinda like a bubble, very smooth and round, not even broken up with a nose, and rosy cheeks with balloon-like lips. I also find it kinda funny how he's obviously a water-based boss, him typically carrying around a small spear gun on the top of everything else I've already pointed out, yet unlike his previous iteration, his face is exposed. It makes me think of an underwater race like Atlanteans, but rather than the stereotypical sexy man that would fill the role, we get this little goober instead. As for who's better, I like the less obvious coloration on the original, but EXE has more nice little touches that I can talk about. Plus, he kind of reminds me of Shin-chan, so I'm going with him. Party, party, join us, join us. Quickman's my favorite from Mega Man 2, so this is a very important matchup for me. He's primarily red with yellow for his accessories, which, given the explosive speed he has, is appropriate. His bodysuit underneath is black because he's real cool. He has a boomerang on his head, a boomerang on his chest, and given that his weapon is the quick boomerang, it's pretty on brand. He fires these things out of the little yellow box on his right arm, which feels like a Batman accessory, so I dig it. I've always loved the idea of offensive boomerangs, which might have originated with him, so I appreciate just how all about them he is, even if his main form of attack is crashing into you. Seriously, if you have to tank a hit, throw yourself into the rangs. I also like how solid his torso looks with those sharp shoulders. Overall, just a really solid design. I wonder how they came up with it. Compare that with the Netnavis and... Okay, so the basics are all there. The red, the yellow, the black, the boomerang on his forehead. He's got the 3D yellow collar sticking out of his chest, as well as some pretty sharp looking knee pads. Both of his wrists has half of a boomerang, which he tosses off after combining for his attacks. That's kinda neat, but it feels like he's adding a step, which kinda sums up this whole form. While I can appreciate the extra details to spiff up a character, here, he just feels over-designed. Original Quickman is awesome, and he knows it. He has nothing to prove. He doesn't need to add in a bunch of extras to feel validated and catch people's eyes. The newer version, on the other hand, just feels like he's trying way too hard. I'd expect someone like this to be constantly posing while asking, "Pretty cool, right?" every few minutes. He saw how cool the original was and his confidence completely crumbled, so he overdid it in an attempt to stand out. But maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe I'm projecting my own biases too much. Better judge these two by the only metric that matters. Comparing them to Kashan, all of them have yellow boomerangs on their heads, so no help there. Both him and the original, though, have their symbol on their chest, Kashan having a letter C. Is that why I like Cutman.exe so much? More importantly than that though, there's not a bunch of extraneous bits thrown in, making him feel over-designed. Besides the stuff I already mentioned, he has muscles, a popped collar, and 2 guns on his hips that he uses for propulsion, oddly enough. He's perfect the way he is, and any attempts to make him look sharper and edgier would be a disservice. You get out of here, Robot Hunter Kashan! As similar as the two designs are, I like Classic Quick more, by a lot. And we finally hit our first hiccup. That's right, for some dumb reason, Crashman does not have a Netnavis version of himself. I thought that I had to be mistaken, especially with the popularity of 2, and that there must be a Crash.exe in some little known spin-off, maybe one of the Japanese only, but nope. Trying to Google it only turns up fan stuff, there is no official Navi equivalent. So let's give him a look. Does he deserve not to have an EXE? He's another one with a warm color palette, being largely this shade of red that I'm almost tempted to call red-orange, with some yellow bits thrown in around some of his edges. He seems to be wearing a white bodysuit underneath, which gives him a clean look, which seems a little ironic given his more Demolition Derby style design. I like the contrast though. Maybe they were going with an Evel Knievel sort of look. He's got the green jewel in his chest, which doesn't really match anything else he has going on, but I don't think it needs to, and it helps the little details stand out. To get into more specifics, his helmet is interesting. Not sure if there's a real-world equivalent, but the window visor is pretty sharp and sticks out pretty far, so I wonder if the idea is that he could charge you head-on, and even if he were going for the headbutt, he could still keep an eye on you. Then of course there's his signature weapon, the Crash Bomber, drill-shaped bombs that he shoots from his lack of hands. Not really sure where they got the idea of a bomb that can latch onto something with a drill before exploding, but it's creative, and I'm a fan of using them in Smash to mess with people. Not that we can count that in his favor, and it's a shame for his fine motor skills as well. His in-game sprite also gives me the impression that he's one of the smaller robot masters, so I find him kinda cute. The helmet, warm colors, and pointy hands all give the impression of him being a pretty rough and tumble guy, so I think his design's pretty good and I wish he would have gotten a Netnavi. So what to do? Call it a win by default for Classic? No, that's gonna mess up our numbers real quick. I don't want to skip over him either though, so let's pair him up with a Navi that doesn't have an original Robot Master but has a similar feel to one, and have them face off in a bonus round. We'll keep the scores separate, that way people can decide on their own whether they want to count it or not. Getting back to it, this raises another problem though. The closest Navi to Crashman in appearance is Drillman.exe, and he's obviously spoken for, so what to do? Going through all the Navis, I have solid matchups for every one except for Jamming Man and Cash, both from the Japanese-only Phantom of Network. Jamming Man's weird, cone face kind of looks like Crashman's helmet, but that's about the only thing I can really come up with, so we'll do Cash instead. Both are small, and while Crash is mostly red with a bit of white, Cash is white with a bit of red. It's odd just how white he is, since any smudges will instantly stand out, so it gives the sense that he thinks himself untouchable. Not only that, but it's normally the sort of color you'd associate with purity, like with a wedding dress or an angel. Yet with his horns and red eyes, he comes off more as a devil, which is really striking. He also has shoulder spikes and red rings, which I'm not sure what to make of, but they do look threatening. His Navi symbol and gray rectangles keep him from being too plain, yet they almost get lost next to his other details. He actually does look pretty cool. Then you get his second form, which is mostly the same but bigger and more imposing, with streams of data where his gray bits used to be. While I should probably find this form cooler and scarier, I think his hulking form loses some of the personality you got in his initial stage. If I had to rank these three, I'd say Crash is better than Final Cash, but Baby Cash beats the Robot Master, so I guess Battle Network wins the bonus round. I just really like Cash's demonic feel, the contrast between his small stature and innate threat, and his color scheme is so uncommon that it really leaves an impression. Damn it, as if his exclusion wasn't insult enough. I really wanted Crash to win this one. Should have had him go up against Jamming Man, that would have been easy. Flashman and Flashman, a combination to rival Cyber Warrior Porygon. The original is doing the same thing as Airman, primarily blue with yellow for contrast. It looks a bit odder here though, maybe because unlike Airman, who had the different colors be for different parts, the yellows are smack dab in the middle of the blues. Given that his whole thing is bright flashes, it does kinda look like a light shining through the dark, so while odd, it works. Besides that, his Buster is white, almost like someone forgot to color it in. Still though, it makes it stand out, being the only thing with that color. Given the rounded and gleaming shoulders and helmet, it gives the impression of a light bulb, the light blues being turned off, while the yellow on his head being on. It's a cool design. The Netnavi form is largely the same, but sleeker and sexier, which feels like an odd thing to say about Flashman. The cool blues dominate his design, not really clashing with the yellow, which you'd find on his head and shoulders. These are also his flashy bits, not just giving the impression of bright lights, but being just that in actuality. It's the same basic idea as before, but feels executed a bit better. Besides that, he looks even more like a robot than his ancestor. Between the whole lack of facial features outside of his eyes, the wires on his back, and his more rigid looking armor. The pieces on his wrist look sharper and cover his hands from some angles, giving not just protection, but also possibly hiding sleights of hand, if he wanted to be a sneaky boy. I'm pretty meh on the original Flashman's design, but am a big fan of the reimagining, so this is an easy point for Battle Network. On to Heatman and Heatman.EXE. The original's a little Zippo lighter, hatch on the top that can cover up his head for defense. He continues the yellow-red trend, great for a flame boss, and he has a green gem in his center, which is a nice bit of flair. In addition to that, he's another tiny, cute little guy. Not much to say beyond that. They took a commonplace item, instantly recognizable, and turned it into a robot, getting his entire point across at a glance. He's a really clever design. Moving on to his new form, and it appears that Heatman died and went to hell. He's still a lighter, this time with more detail, no legs, and noodle arms, ending in some industrial fingers with burner patterns around the wrist. Add on to that his creepier face with his flaming eyes, and the guy looks like a damned soul. This brings us back around to the Airman situation, the new form looking cooler than the old, but here I think it actually works. Fan face is silly, but adding some edge to the design actually works really well when it comes to flames, and combining that with his more demonic demeanor, I'd say they took a great design and managed to make it even better. Another one for Battle Network. Wood is good, so two fellers must be better. I don't even know if that second one works as a slant rhyme. But Woodman and Woodman.EXE. I'm surprised I like the classic version as much as I do. A robot made of wood is kind of a weird idea. Then again, Futurama did it, so Wily might have been ahead of his time. Either way, Woodman looks like someone cut down some stout trees, hollowed out the parts of appropriate thickness, and just kinda threw them together as some very weird armor. It just feels so dumb, and yet I think it works because of what an early design he is. If Woodman came about in 6 or later, I probably would have looked at him and thought, they're running out of ideas. Because he showed up in 2 though, it makes me think that they believed in this idea rather than just cranking him out due to laziness. The novelty is preserved. For just a few interesting little notes, his hands are flesh-colored, which is really unusual for a robot master, maybe to give the impression that he is just an eccentric guy out in nature as opposed to some high-tech creation. And while I guess I always never really thought about how he fired off his leaves, the little trails of propulsion do clear things up and is consistent with the sci-fi setting. Compare that to EXE and he looks like an actual tree, with mechanical arms and legs stapled on. His rounded bottom reminds me of Weeble's, so the flat feet are probably there for practical reasons, to keep him from tilting over. While I have no idea what the gauge he has on is for, I do appreciate the strongman undies he has. While I don't hate the Navi, I do think the RM does a better job of getting the nature theme across, which is ironic since I compared the Navi to an actual tree. Plus, EXE's face is kinda derpy. If he were a Sonic character, he'd be looking for Froggy. Needless to say, this round goes to Classic, though if I could give it to any iteration, this is the only time I choose Fully Charged. Dude's lanky, and he can collapse his form into itself, like a transformer, to look like a random piece of broken tree. Between this and him running around, talking to rocks while having PTSD flashbacks and ambushing intruders with ninja techniques, he's my favorite character from that very questionable series. Now for Wily. No, I did not forget about him last time. I just saved him for the second game since I wouldn't have had a bonus character otherwise, and it helped balance things. Plus, in the first title, he just stole a bunch of Lightbots, whereas this time they're all his own custom creations, so I think this entry is the one where he really shines. Moving past the method to my madness, we have a Dr. Wily and a Mr. Wily, because while Thomas becomes Japanese in an alternate timeline, Albert just loses his doctorate. In the classic series, he gets the role treatment, having a few different costumes depending on how he's feeling that day. In 11, he gets dark clothes to contrast his white lab coat that he's kind of wearing like a jacket, with the red tie and skull belt buckle. Pretty spiffy. In 8, he's a bit more flamboyant, him having more of a cape than coat, with gold buttons, purple ribbon, and pink inner lining, with a white skull on his belt that stands out a lot more than the one we just mentioned. Of course, I mainly think of his NES iteration. Like all of them, he has a bald head with gray hair poofed out in a ring along the sides, and that mustache, plus the cleft chin. His clothing is a bit more basic, blue pants, possibly jeans, with the gold buckle and red tie, a white lab coat over everything. While his other two interpretations give off a more supervillain vibe, with the more over-the-top bits in 8, or the grimmer and more broody version in 11, the earlier Wily outfit makes him look more like just a regular guy, wearing casual clothes with the coat to distinguish him as a scientist, albeit one that looks a lot like Einstein. Then you get Mr. Wily, and goodness, he takes being nefarious pretty seriously. Monocle, darker clothing, well, maybe other than 11, and a big, popped red collar, plus sometimes he carries a cane with a skull on it. While he still has a wreath of hair and mustache, they're much spikier and seem more unkempt. On top of that, his head seems a bit larger and has an odd divot in it, and it also looks like he has a few liver spots in some of the portrait sprites, so you get the general impression that this version's been through a bit more. Looking at their younger selves, Albert still has a very chiseled chin and his hair's kinda poofed out behind him, so you can definitely imagine the transition. Whereas Mr. still has his spiky hair, but his neat glasses and pencil mustache kinda give you a contrast to show just how off the rails he goes. I think both work well with their older selves. Which Wily you like better, I think largely comes down to what sort of vibe you get from Mega Man. The classic is more goofy and energetic, a crazy man that no plan would seem too zany coming from. Battle Network seems much more sinister and damaged, making him feel more dangerous as well. If you want a villain that wouldn't look out of place getting unmasked at the end of an episode of Scooby-Doo, Dr. Wily's your man. If you want a bad guy from an old children's anime that still has some pretty dark undertones, commanding enemies that should be far beyond his power, Mr. Wily's the way to go. While I have been a weeb and really do love some of those old cheesy anime titles, my sense of whimsy makes me go with classic Wily on this one. Both series are jockeying back and forth again. I swear I'm not doing this on purpose to maintain suspense or so that I can cap things off by saying something tepid like both are equal and it's a tie at the end. At the moment, either Classic is ahead by 1, 9-8, or tied with Battle Network if you're willing to count Cash's round. I honestly thought my retro bias would have the originals ahead by more, but I suppose both would fit into that category at this point. Though what are your own scores looking like, and are there any particular reasons why? The first two Battle Networks focus pretty heavily on early Robot Masters, but they start getting a little more spread out going forward. Further rounds might take a little longer for me to put together, but I am planning on matching up the Netnavis with their mainline counterparts up until 8 in base. If you're having fun with this series, maybe consider sticking around and subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching. For everlasting peace.